The following program is presented as a public service by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation.
But the laws against recruiting were severe. Morty O'Sullivan, for instance, charged with recruiting, was dragged through the sea for 50 miles before his head was cut off and mounted on the jail in Cork.
KTCA TV, St. Paul, Minneapolis, presents Ireland Rediscovered, a series of 13 programs dealing with the significance of the Irish nation, which has emerged to statehood in our own times. Dr. John McKiernan, head of the Department of English at the College of St. Thomas in St. Paul, and an authority on Ireland, is host and lecturer. The title of this program is Walking Europe. Here again is Professor McKiernan.
In this program, I should like to tell you something of the curious history of the Irish on the continent of Europe. Walking Europe, we have called this lecture. And walking, indeed, is what the Irish have done for centuries on that continent. They have walked it in 3 different capacities, if not more. Now I should like to direct your attention to the Irish in Europe to emphasize the fact that Ireland is a European nation. I must emphasize it, if only to correct the notion that the Irish are the only foreigners who have more relatives in America than they have at home. But Irish culture is European. The Irish island was settled by Europeans, by immigrants from Central Europe. The old and interesting language whose script you see at the beginnings of these programs is a European language. The fate and destiny of Ireland has been influenced and shaped by European events. For all of these reasons, you see, Ireland is a European nation, and her contacts, which we have explored in earlier programs with the Americas, North and South, have been late contacts. Ireland's earliest contacts were with Europe. Although Ireland is a European nation, influenced by the continent, and in turn having influenced the continent, interestingly enough, she was never part of the Roman Empire. And this really is of extreme importance. Since she was not part of the Roman Empire, she was able, when Rome collapsed, to bring back to Rome, to the continent, what Rome had given her. And now we begin the story of Ireland and Europe by remarking that the single most important event in the history of Ireland was probably the introduction of Christianity, the bringing to this little island off the coast of Europe the traditions of Greece and Rome, as these in turn had been modified by the introduction of the Hebraic influences of Christianity. A most extraordinary thing happened in Ireland with the introduction of Christianity. Christianity did not come to a barbarous nation, although a nation outside the pale, outside the sphere of influence of Greece and Rome. It came to a nation that had developed a very high level of sophistication. And when upon that, or to that level of sophistication, had been imposed the traditions of Rome and Greece and the shaping influences of Christianity, the Irish nature changed overnight. And the most astonishing phenomenon took place. In fact, historians still remark upon it. People could not flock in too great numbers to monasteries. They crowded monasteries. They sought lonely, secluded islands, for instance, where they erected small beehive huts, if you will, and lived hermetical lives. They swarmed across onto the continent, sending hundreds and thousands of missionaries across the face of Europe, founding monasteries whose names today are often the names of cities. This is what took place when Christianity stimulated the Irish character. Now, I should, I suppose, in talking about the Irish swarming into the monasteries and across the continent of Europe as missionaries and scholars, I should, I suppose, mention the name of Columkill, but he confined his activities chiefly to Iona, to the Christianization of Scotland, and his monks were responsible for the Christianization of northern England. I should mention him because he is a great hero of the Gael. He was not only a missionary, but a man a descendant, if you will, of the royal line, and himself a prince in his own right. But the man I should like to tell you about today is, perhaps we might say, the patron saint of Europe, though not officially. His name is Columbanus, a most remarkable man. A man who, for instance, spent approximately 40 years of his life in an Irish monastery in the north of Ireland, a town which you can visit today called Bangor, a very flourishing monastery there. Columkill spent slightly over 40 years of his life there, and then he besought his abbot for permission to go to Europe. It wasn't given too readily, but it was given. And a man now in his mid-40s left Ireland, sailed down the Irish Sea, touching at England, over into France. And the map which you saw a few moments ago indicates some of the places, or many of the places, which he not only visited, but in which he established monasteries of his own. He went to Angers in France to establish a monastery there, another one at Fontenay, another one at Luxeuil. This a particularly famous one, a picture of which you see now, a picture representing the modern abbey, but a particularly famous abbey, one which became the mother house of over 100 abbeys in Germany, France, Switzerland, and other places. In this particular monastery, Columbanus perpetuated, you might say, a miracle through the monks who had accompanied him and through others who came there to work with the Irish monks. He converted or reconverted almost the entire Burgundian Empire. It is unbelievable, the energy of this man and his co-workers. But after about 20 years there, and after building the monastery, converting huge numbers of people, bringing back the piety and the morality which had been swept away by the barbarian invasions from the north, after doing all of this, he unfortunately spoke out too harshly against the morality of the queen and her son, and for this he was banished. An attempt was made to send him back to Ireland, an attempt that was not too successful. I might show you the wanderings of this particular man. Leaving the north of Ireland, coming down here over to the continent of Europe. And though I won't detail it now, all of these heavy lines indicate the journeyings, the mission journeyings of this particular saint. The point is, he was banished from Luxeuil, where he had done such effective work, and an attempt made to send him back to Ireland. For one reason or another, the attempt failed, but he realized his usefulness was at an end there. And now an old man, if we may call that old, certainly 65 or slightly beyond, he decided to go over the Alps. And on the way, a long journey made on foot of thousands of miles. On the way, he and his companions passed through what is now the town of St. Gall in Switzerland. And this town takes its name from one of his companions, whose name was Gall. And the abbey which they established there with its famous library was to become and remain for centuries one of the great abbeys of Europe. Columbanus left behind him St. Gall, and with several of his other companions continued across the Alps, passing through a town which is now named after him, San Colombo, in Italy, but eventually reaching what we call today Bobbio, and establishing there another monastery, one which was again to become a center of orthodoxy and an extraordinarily important abbey and monastery in the history of Catholicism in Italy. Columbanus's tomb is there today, the remnant of this great man who, over 60, set out on foot, afire with the love that motivated these Irish to preach and to teach. There, today, his name is treasured, and the rule that he left behind him. It was to the aged Columbanus that a new king of France sent messengers at the beginning of the 7th century, begging him to return and bring that love of learning and that great noble height of morality which Columbanus represented, to bring it back to France. But Columbanus was now over 70, and he knew his years were at an end, so that today his name is forever associated with Bobbio. Now, Columbanus may be typical of that large number of Irish lay people, scholars, missionaries, who flooded out of Ireland, bringing a fresh new growth, if you will, to the lands of Europe that had been parched by the barbarian invasion. They tell the story of, during the time of Charlemagne, of the arrival in one of the market towns of France of a pair of Irish scholars who stood in the marketplace along with all the other merchants selling their meats and their vegetables and their bread and so on. And these two Irishmen standing there crying, "Wisdom for sale, wisdom for sale." It captures the imagination, of course, but it does give us an insight into the fervor with which these men preached the love of learning and the love of God. And we do know that wherever they went, they introduced the arts of reading and writing, the love of learning, the knowledge of classical Latin, the knowledge of Greek too. Indeed, the Irish at this time possibly had the best Greek scholars on the continent. But they introduced the more practical arts, agriculture, the arts of decoration, skilled handicrafts, and so on. So they were the teachers, if you will, of Europe. Now, when we look at a map of Europe, and note, for instance, in northern France, the town of Péronne, we have here a town whose patron saint is an Irish, one of these Irish saints, Saint Fursey. If we look into Germany, the town of Würzburg, we have there, of course, another patron, another Irish saint as patron, Saint Kilian. If we think of Salzburg, we have there represented another patron saint who is Irish, Saint Fergal. In Latin, it is often called Virgilius. These are typical, then, of the Irish. And I should like to sum up a remark of one of the great German scholars, for instance, Professor Zimmer, who had this to say about the contribution of the Irish. She has spread her learning amongst the German and Romance peoples, thus forming the actual fountain of our present continental civilization. This a tribute from a German historian. So from the 6th to the 9th century, and beyond certainly, but particularly in these 3 centuries, the Irish, in response to the stimulus of Christianity, flooded across Europe as missionaries and as scholars, indeed as a combination of both. This was the first great Irish walking of the continent of Europe. Now, something happened in the 9th century with the invasions of the Vikings, and this disrupted, at least for a time, Irish civilization. It didn't completely stop, but it certainly slowed down the exodus of Irish scholar missionaries to the continent. At the beginning of the 11th century, the Irish defeated the Scandinavians and were once more, to a certain extent at any rate, in control of their own country. But toward the end of that 11th century, the Norman English arrived, and that began another long story. So that you see, beyond the 9th century, the Irish had to spend a great deal of their effort simply in protecting themselves, in repairing the depredations upon their country, and so on, so that the walking of the saints and scholars came slowed down to a bare crawl. Something happened then a great deal later. The success of the English military plans in Ireland brought about another great exodus. In Irish history, it is called the Flight of the Earls. A most extraordinary event. In September 1607, after the defeat of the Irish at a very important battle in Irish history, the Battle of Kinsale, the Irish leaders fled the country. These people were the lineal descendants of the same Gaels who had colonized Ireland several centuries before Christ. They were the, shall we call them, the flower of the nobility of Ireland. They had to flee, having been defeated by the English, and knowing that their future was almost without hope if they remained in Ireland. They fled to the continent and remarkably retraced the steps of the earlier saints, not now because they wanted to retrace the steps of the saints, but simply because they were looking for that help all the way down, you see, to Rome. Looking for that help which they hoped the continental allies might bring to them, to their cause, a most hopeless cause, if you will. They left Ireland and walked the face of Europe, looking for allies, but all Europe was too busy to help. Now, even though these were only 99, and even though this took place at the very beginning of the 17th century, it was a type, it typified, it was an archetype, if you will, of what was to come. They walked, these earls, the flight of the earls, they walked Europe in 1607, 1608, and they died abroad, and many of them have left their hearts and their bodies in Rome. But they typified what was to happen before the century was over. The Irish were once more disastrously defeated by superior British power at the end of that 17th century. And now began an exodus from Ireland, an exodus that was not to end for a long time. These men, these young men who left, were called the wild geese. They flew their own country. They could do her no good at home. As soldiers abroad, they hoped they might at least strike a blow against the oppressor of their country. They offered their services to France, to Spain, to anyone whose policy was to fight England. Such was the origin of the Irish Brigades on the continent. A romantically tragic story, a story of hundreds of thousands, literally hundreds of thousands of young men leaving Ireland from the latter part of the 17th century and all through the 18th century, leaving the country of their birth to go abroad, to serve in a foreign army, to serve a master who was not their own, knowing the pangs and the pains of loneliness, men who could sing the tune, "The Girl I Left Behind Me," men whose whole hearts were filled with the love of Ireland, and yet offering themselves, if you will, to foreign monarchs. Now, it has been conservatively estimated that 500,000 such Irish soldiers died in the Irish brigades in the service of France. And it is interesting for us to note that the last two campaigns of the Irish brigades were fought on American soil. The Siege of Savannah and the Battle of Yorktown. Both were participated in, if I may use a very awkward construction, were participated in by soldiers of the Irish Brigade. It would be only fair to add, however, that at this moment the Irish Brigade was not composed, or the Irish Brigades were not composed only of Irish, although they were commanded by Irish and by the descendants of those Irish. The Irish Brigades stirred the imagination of the people at home. They heard tales, of course, of the success on the continent. You can just imagine how the minds of young Irish lads at home were set aflame by the tales, the romantic, and the tragedy, of course, is always omitted from these, but the romantic tales of the heroism, of the valor, of the travels, of the excitement of their cousins, their friends, and simply fellow Gaels on the continent. Recruiting was very active in Ireland for this sort of thing. And, well, for instance, a great deal of smuggling on the west coast of Ireland, on the southern coast, and so on. England was more or less in control of the country, and the Irish didn't mind smuggling in silks or wines or tobaccos or anything of that sort. And these smugglers always left with a full boat, left for the continent with a boat of volunteers for the Irish Brigade. If one were caught recruiting for the Irish Brigade, the penalty was very severe. English law was quite direct and blunt. And one example, for instance, of Morty O'Sullivan, who was caught recruiting for the Irish Brigade and who was dragged for 50 miles behind a boat through the sea, and then half drowned and in battered shape, had his head cut off and mounted on Cork jail. Still, the recruiting went on. Well, we might tell of one of the classic battles of the Irish Brigade in the service of France, because Irish brigades fought in the service of other countries too. The Battle of Fontenoy in May 1745 was actually, in the 18th century, regarded as perhaps the greatest military engagement that had ever taken place. There were over 50,000 British troops and their allies, and over 50,000 French troops participating in that battle. And the tide of the battle was against the French until the king himself was on the battlefield, until with the permission of the king and Marshal Saxe, the Irish were allowed to fight their traditional enemies, the English. Now, the English were exemplified the most heroic valor on that field. In the face of the most decimating fire, they came steadily across the field, and it seemed as though nothing could stop them. At the last moment, the Irish were allowed, because the French, while they were appreciative of their services, were not entirely certain that if the best of the French troops had been of no avail in stopping the English, they were not entirely certain that the Irish could. But the Irish sprang into that battle with a war cry that meant a great deal to them, shouting in their own language, "Remember our broken homes, remember Limerick." They sprang into the battle and turned the tide. The Irish poem says, compares them in their charge to lions, like lions leaping at a fold when mad with hunger's pang, right up against the English line, the Irish exiles sprang. This is the poetic reminiscence of it in Ireland. Well, we might mention that an Irish legion served also in Spain. In fact, the Irish Legion in Spain was older than the Irish brigades in France. Though the Irish brigades lasted in France down to 1791, and in 1792 the Count of Provence, the man who later became Louis XVIII, gave to them a regimental flag and spoke highly of his appreciation of their services to France. And indeed, even today on the Arch of Triumph in Paris, you can read the names of some of the leaders of the Irish Brigade, particularly Dillon. There were others, there were Lally's, Ruth and Clare and so on, but Dillon was a particularly well-known one, and you can see his name today on the Arch of Triumph. But the Irish Legion in Spain had an equally romantic and a longer and more ancient association with the Irish in their capacity as soldiers walking Europe. Many of them married into royal families. This is most extraordinary. The Irish were extremely well appreciated. We have, for instance, in Vienna, a bust of a man who became the Count, Baron O'Brien. Actually, there's a granite obelisk put up to him in that city, commemorating his services to Vienna. There was an Irish governor of Vienna in his time, Andrew O'Reilly. There was another Irish count, Ulrich Maximilian Brown. I shouldn't say Irish-born, but a descendant of these brigadiers. And this man himself was made the generalissimo of all Austrian forces, made field marshal by Marie Therese, the well-known empress. Well, such was the walking of the Irish from the 6th to the 9th century, bringing to Ireland culture, the Latin traditions and the Greek traditions brought to her by Christianity, later fleeing their country when there was no room for them at home and offering their services abroad. Now, in the 20th century, we have the Irish once more walking the continent of Europe. Extraordinarily so. They go now as the modern businessman with his attaché case. And one need not quote statistics to remark that freedom in the 20th century has brought to Ireland a new sense of life and joy. And though once more the Irish walk Europe, it is not now with the pilgrim's staff in hand, or with the book, nor with the musket, but it's with the businessman's portfolio. Such is the meaning of freedom to a country. In the next program, we shall answer the question, who were the Irish?
Ireland Rediscovered is produced by KTCA TV, Twin Cities Area Educational Television Corporation. The next title in this series is Who Were the Irish? Host and lecturer is Dr. John McKiernan. Ireland Rediscovered is directed by Carl Brookins and produced by Joseph McDermott. This program was presented as a public service by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation.